Online, there are all kinds of tests that you can turn to sort you into a political group, whether it's libertarian, progressive, liberal, conservative, or something else. But this is a tribal mindset healthy for our society. A recent piece published by the Heterodox Academy makes the argument that the political spectrum as we know it does not exist, and that people shift their beliefs to fit in with the tribe rather than picking a group based on previously held beliefs. And journalist and friend of the show, Zaid Jilani, joins us now to explain a little bit more on this. Zaid, it's great to see you. How are you?
It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Dig into this a little bit, Zaid. I know that this is something you're really passionate about, which is that, in our politics right now, everybody just tries, if you're red, you have prescriptions of beliefs, blue prescriptions. But the reality is, in the lived experience, so to speak, of many Americans, is people hold all sorts of contradictory opinions all the time from different political parties.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it would surprise a lot of people to know that when we think about purely sorted political or partisan tribes, we think about, okay, if you're a Democrat, you believe a certain thing on abortion, a certain thing on trade, a certain thing on taxes, so on and so forth. And Republicans also have fixed views. But the reality is most people have a mix of left-wing or right-wing views, and those views change a lot over time. Often we shift, for instance, just to fit in with our tribe. We've seen that, for instance, on Russia, where I think that conservatives at one point were much more anti-Russia. I think with the Trump government coming to power, they became much more pro-Russia. They became much more skeptical of trade, for instance, when Trump came to power. And a lot of that is just shifting with your tribe. I mean, you pick a tribe, and then you justify the beliefs kind of following after that. And I think actually this is really important because it shows that while people often have deeply held values, and that's probably a more innate and less movable things, the way they express those values in terms of actual politics, in terms of what they're trying to do with policy, is very flexible. Actually, it can change quite a bit. That's what it seems to be when we look at this.
Mm-hmm. And Zaid, how does that relate to maybe our current political moment about what's going on right now? Because it seems to be, people will say, Democrats in particular are saying, look at the support for Black Lives Matter. But, that seems to be an 80-20 issue almost, or something, 70-30. But how does that translate into actual policy beliefs and then the way that something like this gets capitalized on, so to speak? And what are the pitfalls of thinking monolithically about how people think?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one in that I think a lot of the symbology around it is probably more controversial than some of the policy around it. So, for instance, I think Americans overwhelmingly support reforms like, asking police officers to wear body cameras, like doing some different things when it comes to accountability and transparency. But it doesn't really mean that they necessarily agree on every slogan, on every issue. For instance, like Colin Kaepernick, when he was taking a knee with the NFL, that was highly controversial. It was kind of a 50-50 issue where half the country found it to be somewhat offensive, half of them found it to be very sympathetic to it. But if you started polling them on the various issues undergirding like prison reform, police reform, there's actually tons of agreement. It's just the disagreement was largely how they perceived a symbol, right, which is the American flag. Some people see it as a sacred sort of expression of American patriotism, and you should be solemn and kind of formal around it. Others see it as kind of the ultimate protest symbol. But no matter what you felt on that kind of highly polarized issue, you can still discuss the policy itself and find tons of agreement, which kind of showed why his protest wasn't necessarily the most effective thing in the world, because it became a debate around the symbol rather than a debate around the issues. But that happens again and again. I think we're seeing a little bit of that with the argument over various statues and renaming things. I think many of the people who disagree about these things would agree on the underlying points of saying we should promote, racial equality, we should promote reconciliation, we should treat everyone fairly. But maybe they view the symbols as differently. Maybe some people view them as facets of history or reconciliation. Others see them as facets of one ideology that was very wicked, supportive of enslavement or racism or other things. So oftentimes these symbols make it look like we are sharply divided, we're unmovable. But once we actually start talking about solving problems, which is fundamentally what governance is about, I think we find that people can move around a lot, and actually there's a lot more agreement than we expect.
See, I think this is always so important to remember, especially in polarizing times like right now. But how can you move past kind of the symbology when people are so completely divided on that? Have there been effective ways? Give us an example of like effective social movements that have been able to move past symbology, move on the policy, and ultimately unite the country, or at least push the country in a better direction.
Yeah, I think that, it's really, really important to always try to bring the conversation to, okay, what can we do together to work on, some kind of specific problem, being as specific as possible. It's not super useful to fight over the slogan Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, so on and so forth. You can have that argument going on for years about symbology, but it'd be really useful to talk about, okay, what do good police rules of engagement look like? I think a lot of people would agree on that because we actually have a lot of the same values on that. Just try to move past the slogans, be as specific as possible about policy, as specific as possible about solutions, and there will still be disagreements there, but it'll be clear that everyone's trying to get to the solution. And you'll see a lot more overlap in that than you will feel about symbology, because symbology is very hardwired to us. And I think sometimes two people will look at the exact same thing, like a flag, and see entirely different things. And that's just not as helpful when it comes to getting to solutions.
Yeah, Zaid, also while we had you, I wanted to get your take on what's going on in your home city of Atlanta. Just, in terms of obviously the fatal shooting that was involved, the firing and the handling of all of that, and also on Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and her kind of ascendance in Joe Biden's vice presidential list, which we talked about earlier in the show. What's your take on much of what's going on down there?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was on Fox last, I talked about Lance Bottoms, and I said that I felt like she was handling this a little bit better than some other mayors, in that she was pairing police reform with also very unequivocally condemning looting, rioting, arson. And I think that's part of the reason Atlanta saw a lot less of this, that people felt less licensed to do it. Of course, this latest shooting casts a pall over that. Many people are questioning her leadership now. And of course, the shooting itself is much thornier, I think, than what happened with George Floyd. It seemed like the man in question got into a physical fight with police officers and took one of their tasers. At that point, many police feel authorized to shoot. Many would say it was still unnecessary. So I think this is going to be a much thornier case. And I think for Lance Bottoms, she's going to be hit from both sides on this, because I think a lot of people in Atlanta are very kind of tribal about public safety. It tends to be a little bit safer among a lot of the big cities, and they like that safety, and they're going to have a reflexive response in favor of police. But at the same time, the left, I think, is seeing every case through kind of a singular lens, where I think they wouldn't really take into account the officer's point of view here, or take into account the fact the officers were attacked. And they want to see justice. And to them, justice would mean not only firing the officer, but arresting them. But it may be actually very difficult to prosecute a case where the officers were assaulted. I mean, usually in those cases, when they go to court, the officers are cleared. And that's just going to be a very difficult thing, I think, for people on all sides to kind of accept. Is that sometimes very unfortunate things happen, but maybe a law wasn't broken. So
yeah, I think that's probably the right way to look at it. All right, Zaid, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.